Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is The Briefing. Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Iranian woman, visited Tehran on the 13th of September 2022. While there, she was arrested by Iran's religious police for wearing her hijab incorrectly. She was taken from custody to hospital in a coma and covered in bruises. She would die of her injuries 3 days later. What happened next was extraordinary. Leaked photographs of Mahsa drew crowds of protesters, first to the streets outside the hospital, and then all across Iran, even inside schools. In the crackdown that followed, human rights groups say that 500 Iranians were killed, including 72 children. 2 journalists remain imprisoned for sharing protest images, Niloufar Hamedi and Elaheh Mohammadi. We polled our journalist fellows to ask, given the current geopolitical climate, do you feel enough attention is being paid by global journalism to events in Iran? 79% said no, 7% said yes, and 14% were unsure. Collaborating with foreign media is a punishable offense in Iran, but our guest in this seminar, Emmy award-winning producer Sasha Joelle Achilli, gathered 350 clips shared on social media, 100 hours of film, then interviewed protesters and activists to create the documentary Inside the Iranian Uprising. We'll ask her how she navigated the archiving and editing process, how interviewees were protected, and the ethical considerations to take while reporting on a story when you can't be on the ground. That's The Briefing. Let's begin. Hello and welcome to the penultimate Global Journalism Seminars of the term. We're joined by Sasha Joelle Achilli, an Emmy and BAFTA award-winning producer who will be talking to us about her documentary Inside the Iranian Uprising, which she produced alongside Iranian filmmaker and director Majid Naisi. Welcome, Sasha.
Hi, Caitlin. Thank you.
Hi. So in addition to your work on Inside the Iranian Uprising, your other documentary work includes Outbreak, about Ebola, Frontline, about Italy's COVID response, and 54 Days, which looked at the US COVID response. On top of that, you're working currently on creating a whole new human, due to be released sometime next month, and a documentary about Syria. That's a very impressive output.
Thank you. Yes.
I do think it's important to say before we begin that this documentary and the interviews in it are so sensitive, and protecting these brave people so important that we recognize that sometimes you won't be able to answer questions fully. We understand that, and we want to learn as much as we can from your experience, but we also want to be wise.
Yeah.
So please feel free not to answer questions or to draw from experience on other documentaries. But let's just start with some background. How did you get involved in the project?
So I wanted to obviously clarify. So Majid Naisi is the director of the documentary, and he was the one who tirelessly gathered over 100 hours of social media footage for months before I even got in touch with him. And so how I got involved was that I was following the events in Iran. I had worked on a couple of films related about Iran previously. One was about the White Wednesday movement in 2018. Where women back then as well had taken off their hijabs in a symbol of protest, were arrested. A few of them had to flee into exile. And then after that one, I actually made a film about the General Qasem Soleimani, who was then killed in early 2020 by an American drone strike. And so obviously I'm quite interested in the country and what's happening there. So I was following the events, and then I was approached by executive producer Fiona Stoughton, who was working with Passion Pictures at the time, saying, Sasha, do you think there's a film that can be made? And my first port of call was actually Majid. Majid and I had never worked together, but we knew each other socially, and he's this kind of incredible immersive filmmaker who spends years and years in immersed and embedded with soldiers, and Shia militants in Iraq, and filming, personal stories around the heroin trade. And I called him and I said, Majid, what do you think? And he said, Sasha, since Mahsa's death, I've been cooped up in my room at night for 12 hours a night, collecting all the social media material. And he knew he wanted to make something with it, but he wasn't 100% sure what that would be. And when he told me he had all this footage, that I realized that was the beginning of the film. And the question that we had to answer was how to make a film with all this footage that could work for TV broadcast, which is kind of quite different to the independent feature doc world, where you have a lot more creative license. How, we'd go about by verifying footage, and then also translating and this footage and providing the context necessary for a foreign audience to understand what was going on. And so that's how it kind of started.
And how did he, I'm trying to imagine how you would even share 100 hours. Was there a spreadsheet? Was it a cloud drive? Was it external drive?
He was very organized from the beginning in terms of how he was saving it and naming it. And what he did was he put together a 20-minute kind of taster for myself and the exec Fiona, which he wrote a narration for, which was very lyrical, incredibly poetic, from the perspective of the street, as if the street were a character and the street were bearing witness to what was going on. And just, that 20 minutes was really gripping. And I felt within that 20 minutes, completely appalled, angry. I knew what was happening in Iran, but I hadn't quite seen that level of violence. And I was just, incredibly moved, angry, and knew that we had to do something, and we had to do it quickly, that we had to get something out quickly. And so that's why then, TV current affairs kind of felt like the right place to pitch it. Eventually, how he shared it, he sent me via post, because I don't live in London, USB stick with all the footage. And then, eventually on editing platforms and stuff.
It's probably worth, it just occurred to me, it was probably worth addressing why are we talking to you, the producer, instead of Majid, the director?
So Majid's English isn't very strong, so I've done a lot of the publicity around the film, and so that's why. Also to mention, it was a huge team effort, because it was a co-production between the BBC and PBS Frontline, produced via Passion Pictures. So, there was another producer called James. He was in charge of all of the fact-checking and verifying of the footage. Frontline has their own team of fact-checkers, and senior producer Dan Edge came in and really helped put this together and get it, delivered in time. So it was a huge kind of editorial team effort. We had 3 editors working on it at the same time, because the turnaround was quite fast for what we were trying to achieve.
It takes a village. And I can believe 3 editors, because of all the face blurring. You were really conscientious about that, making sure that people weren't identifiable. That must have taken hours.
I mean, that's part of the process in terms of who is visible in the social media footage, and who needed, a lot of social media footage isn't good enough quality. A lot of protesters were wearing FP2 masks anyway. It was just a matter of just taking that extra step to make sure, and that takes a lot of time, just the prepping the blurring, like a document that actually James, the other producer, prepped on how it needed to be blurred. And getting the online to do that was really important.
It sounds simultaneously awful and like something I'd really love to do. We do hear quite early on in the documentary, there's a conversation with someone about to be interviewed via Zoom. And I think it's Majid's voice. You hear him saying, I need you to be sure that you're aware of the risks that you're taking here. For those who aren't aware, can you explain the risks that people were taking by speaking to your team?
Well, so it's a really important, the device that we used of featuring three activists as our kind of portals into this story was also partly because of the activists' network and connections. So, for example, Shiva, who is a women's rights activist, now lives in Europe. She was very, very well connected with a lot of the activists from the early days of those protests in Iran, in Tehran, who were then imprisoned. And so she was with a team of people tracking the people who'd gone to prison and helping to provide kind of legal guidance to individuals who had gone to prisons or their families. Right. So she had this existing network. They agreed to speak to her. And obviously, we need to seek consent to be able to film and broadcast their testimony. And everybody who featured in this film does it at a risk. And the risk is that, working and collaborating with foreign journalists, particularly American or British foreign journalists, is seen as a crime and colluding with the enemy. And so it's dangerous. They could be rearrested and charged, and so everybody had to be aware of that and make their own kind of decision and risk. And we obviously, sought consent at the beginning to film these interviews, but then also just kept in touch with the individuals involved, making sure that up to the very end, they still consented to their interview being, and their faces being shown. So, I was actually really impressed that out of all the interviews we did, only, at least what we broadcast, only one interviewee wanted to be blurred. Whereas all the others consented to be seen, which is incredibly brave. Incredibly brave.
Yeah. We mentioned in the briefing Niloufar and Hamedi, who just shared pictures of the protest, and those two journalists are now in jail for 12 to 13 years. So we can imagine how much more severe it would be to take part in an interview.
Yeah, and they were both at the hospital when Mahsa was still in a coma, and they had taken the photo of Mahsa's relatives hugging in the hallway, and that went viral. They were surprisingly also accused of taking the photo of Mahsa in the coma. Obviously, we know, because we feature in our film, the Kurdish activists and journalistic organization that gathered that footage and that photo and spread it. And we know via Awin, the woman in our film, and we know through her source that it wasn't them.
It wasn't them.
They were accused of that. And then they also attended the funerals in Kurdistan at the beginning. And so they were very quickly rounded up after a few weeks. And there was a moment in the spring of this year where there were talks about them potentially facing the crime against God, which can carry the death sentence.
Crime against God.
Yeah.
I will not go on a rant. This is a strange question to ask given our circumstances, but what is it like to conduct an interview over Zoom? Do you have to adapt your interview style? Is there anything you miss about in person?
Yeah, well, so I mean, this film again was particular because the people speaking to our contributors were our characters. Obviously, Majid and I had extra questions here and there, but we let them very much guide the interview. The first film I ever did that was completely remote was 54 Days, which looked at the first 54 days of the COVID response in the United States. And at the time, it was 2020. And my visa for the US had expired. The embassy was shut. No way I could get a visa to go there. And so we said, okay, we're going to have to do this remotely. So I had crews on the ground who were doing in person, like physically shooting the interviews, but I was the interviewee on Zoom. And yeah, I mean, I think it never, like Zoom, you can never build the rapport and feel the room. And feel someone's energy when you're in the room, unless you're in the room. That said, I think at that time it was the only way to do it. And I think, you know, we were able to transcend kind of that digital barrier. But yeah, there is a detachment, there's a distance. So you know, in a way, it's always better if you can to be in the room with contributors. But given the climate that we're living in and given the difficulties it is to reach certain parts of the world, it's also really important to know that this is possible and it can be done in a very effective way. You know, and there's always, I mean, to be honest, like there's always a way to film in impossible places like Iran. A colleague of mine recently made a film looking at 1 year since the Mahsa Amini's death, and she had, you know, undercover journalists working for her, filming inside Iran. That's a way of doing it. So there's always other ways. It's just, you know, what the level of risk is. Who's willing to take that risk. There's always a way. But you as the foreign journalists can't necessarily go in. So then you're guiding whoever it is on the ground doing the undercover work for you, you're guiding them. And that's always really difficult.
Very difficult to be flying blind in that way. Tell me a little bit about. There were two versions of this documentary, in a sense. One was the BBC cut, and one was the PBS cut. And it would be really interesting to hear the different sort of requirements from each commissioner in terms of verification and so on.
So in this case, the BBC exec Sarah Waldron and Dan Edge for Frontline were incredibly aligned. Sarah wanted as close a version to the Frontline version as possible. The big difference is that a Frontline hour is 52 minutes versus a BBC hour is 59 minutes, give or take 30 seconds. And
a lot of time to fill.
Add time to the film. So there's some scenes that are cut differently or don't exist in the PBS scene. So in this case, I want to say, though, they were aligned, especially when it came to the protection of individuals, the blurring, and the verification of the footage. So if we didn't pass Frontline's kind of standard for the verification of a clip, we wouldn't use it for the BBC. It needed to kind of match. And I think that's true when it comes to such sensitive, journalistically sensitive stories. It's that they need to be aligned. It's not like the BBC can suddenly, like, you know, decide, oh, we'll broadcast that anyway, you know, and there's a discrepancy that doesn't happen. It's more around creative decisions and adding scenes that might not fit in the PBS version of the film.
Yeah, and the accent of the narrator.
And the narration is written differently, definitely. So there's always there is a difference in that. And again, the facts need to align, but the way they're written is different. And then we had a British female voice on the BBC version, and we had a British female voice on the Frontline version, but a reporter an Iranian, Ramita Navai, who's an Iranian reporter and producer who works a lot with Frontline. So she's a voice that is known by the Frontline audience.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the people featured. Nika's mother, for me, was really a very powerful figure in this documentary. How did you get her to agree to talk about her loss? And if you know, how is she doing?
So what was extraordinary about this story was not only the bravery of the people protesting, of which a large number were Gen Z, very young women and men, women who started it and backed by the men, definitely. Nika was one of them. And what's extraordinary is that for every one of them who has passed away, the parents have tried to carry on the message and the fight of their children. And the parents seem to, the mothers specifically, to be completely fearless. And, Nika's mum had said, I don't want the blood of our children to wash away in vain. This death needs to mean something. At that point, Nika's profile was so high, and she had been so outspoken, despite the family being threatened by the regime, despite you see in the film, like, manufacturing news around Nika's death and, threatening family members to lie about Nika's death. That weirdly, like, she faced, her public profile had become so high that she faced less of a risk. And again, she agreed to speak to Tsar. Tsar herself has a very interesting story of why she left Iran, and a lot of people are aware of her story and respect her, and also respect the work she's doing now as an actress abroad. And so they kind of see her as a mouthpiece for the revolution. And then her consenting to speaking to us, which was the first international broadcast experience, where it's the first time she's consented to be filmed by an international crew via Tsar. And how do we convince her? I think that she is just immersed in wanting to carry on her daughter's fight and that of the other young people who died for this cause. And we interviewed other mothers who didn't make the film, but all of them are just extraordinary. One of them, and this isn't in the film, but she said, we are volcanoes. We are volcanoes and we're erupting and we're not scared. I think at that point, you don't have much to lose.
Yeah, you've lost. Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. What's left to lose? And you mentioned Gen Z there. It feels like Gen Z was really a differentiating feature of these protests. Do you have any theories as to why? Why?
Again, our kind of women in exile in the film kind of put it very, very well. I think that Gen Z has access via the internet and via social media, and in Iran using lots of VPNs to access a lot of platforms that are forbidden. So they have access to the world outside of Iran. And what is amazing is that they, a lot of Iranians, and I don't want to speak for everyone, and this is based on the conversations I've had and the experience I've had with Iranian people, is that a lot of people feel like they live a double life. As in they have the life they have to live on the streets publicly, and the life they live behind closed doors. So it's notorious, that in Tehran there are these amazing underground parties, and people are like making their own alcohol at home, and living behind closed doors, what looks like what we take for granted on the streets every day, and the parties we have in public and blah blah, they all do it behind closed doors. And I think what's extraordinary is that what Gen Z came onto the streets fighting for, sparked obviously by Mahsa's death, and the reason why she was arrested in the first place, is freedom. And what they're asking for is something that we in the West more generally take for granted, but especially as women, despite we look at like what's happening in the US and stuff, like women's rights are being threatened all the time. So in a way, they're fighting for women's rights in Iran, but it's an extension of fighting for women's rights all over the world. And they're fighting for something really simple, which is freedom of speech and freedom of being. And so I think that's what motivated Gen Z, is that they won't stand for it. Our women, our three main characters are they say, we could be the mothers of that generation, and we kind of just learned to live this double life and to navigate it, but this generation won't stand for it. And you've got kids, I mean, like teenagers and people in their early 20s who go to university, are very well educated, but their prospects are like nothing. They're selling bracelets on the streets, and then they have a degree in like engineering, but there are no like opportunities. So they're kind of sick of this system. They're sick of what has happened to the Iranian economy, but they're sick of not being able to speak freely.
Yeah.
Be free.
Yeah. And the fact that a lot of these young women were dancing to a Nigerian pop star's song, Rema's "Calm Down." How were they exposed to Rema in Iran?
Well, that's it though, but it's through VPNs. Through that, I mean, they like Iranians are there, and there's a huge diaspora, right? So obviously you've got Iranians outside Iran communicating with their families inside Iran. So it's like really easy to access that. It's a great tune. It's such a good tune.
It's a good tune.
You hear it, you want to dance on the streets, and I guess that's what they are doing, is like dancing on the streets and moving their bodies, and so it became kind of a song of the revolution, one of the songs of the revolution, and a lot of the girls who actually filmed themselves dancing to that track were arrested. And I believe actually Rema though made a comment about it in terms of like being very proud of the fact that that song has transcended cultures and transcended everything, and was being used as a symbol of freedom and life and movement. Yeah.
I'm going to come to questions from our journalists downstairs and our audience online. I'll just tell you to please feel free to use the Q&A function to add your questions for Sasha. But before I do, I want to say that I really love that you ended on the hopefulness of these young people dancing, which seems on paper like such a contradiction, but in essence was just so hopeful. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about that decision.
So that was Majid's wish. He wanted to end on a more hopeful note. He didn't want the film to end on a note of, the regime have won yet again. The regime have managed to quash this protest like they claim they have. And he didn't want that to be the note, which was fair enough, because despite all the arrests, despite everything that happened, all the people killed, the acts of protests continue. So it might not be the mass gatherings, but it's the acts of protest of dancing on the street, not wearing the hijab in public, and what is being posted on Instagram continuously are these young women who bravely continue to just like not wear the long manto that covers kind of the body shape on the streets, have their hair out, and these are continuous acts of protest. So it's like ending on this note of resilience that the regime haven't won, and a lot of people tell me that they feel like things can't go back to how they were before Mahsa's death. And so that's the message Majid wanted to end on.
Yeah. He's a poet.
Yeah.
So a question here from Subarno Chatterjee. Is the documentary accessible in Iran? And if yes, what is the feedback? I think I know most of that answer, but maybe to your VPN point.
Yeah. I think everything's always accessible. You look for it. It's not accessible in the sense it's not on BBC Persian. BBC Persian weren't involved in this. It's not accessible on mainstream, but I'm sure it's circulated, and it's had very positive feedback from people outside of Iran and inside Iran. Definitely, yeah.
And Peter Adofo Asante from Ghana says, what risks do people take by just talking to a team? We've sort of answered that a little bit, Peter, but I want to just take a little spin on that question and say, if you weren't producing this documentary, if you were talking to a friend who was considering being involved in a documentary that was this sensitive, what would you want them to know before they agreed to take part? What advice would you give them?
The contributor. That's a good question in terms of like, would I take part in the documentary? It's really hard because as a producer, you spend most of your time trying to convince people to go on camera.
Yeah.
It really depends on the producers you're dealing with. I think there are producers who aren't honest in the industry, who make false promises. And I think that's really dangerous. Telling someone, oh, if you speak to us, things will change. Someone's going to help you. It's happened to me on countless projects, especially dealing with people who are, financially disadvantaged, potentially like illiterate and stuff. It's really dangerous. So I would always evaluate who the team making the film is, not necessarily even the broadcaster, but like the actual team, and their previous work and kind of what their ethics are, and just discussing, kind of risk assessing continuously. And just because you give an interview once, it doesn't mean that then that's it. Like, you still have the power to pull out. It's very inconvenient when that happens, but it's important that people know that, so if circumstances change, you can receive consent. Yeah.
It's a really, really, really good point, Sasha. So ask them what kind of promises are being made to them, remind them that they have the right to remove their consent, and look at their track record and what they've made in the past.
Who the filmmakers are, and because I think it's really important. It depends where you're working. So, I mean, the example I'm thinking of is like, I made a film about the Chibok girls and other girls who'd been kidnapped by Boko Haram in the northeast of Nigeria, and it's really important never to like say, if you participate, someone is gonna sponsor you, blah, blah, like you just have to be really honest, because you're hoping that with every film and story you tell, that there is some kind of change. This is why we do it. Otherwise, why would anyone sit in front of footage or put their own lives at risk going to dangerous places to tell stories for no outcome whatsoever? That makes no sense. Obviously, we're always telling these stories in the hope of bringing awareness, of putting a mark in history, of maybe changing something for someone, but you can't promise that will happen. At the end of the day, we're journalists, we're not social workers. So
very well said. Very well said. Well, let's go downstairs now, and I think let's kick off with Christina from the US. Just give them 1 second to get their camera going. You can do it. There you go. We can hear you.
We can't.
I
believe you need to start it as the host.
How about now?
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for joining us. You spoke a little bit about some of the challenges of interviewing over Zoom, but I was curious if you could speak a little bit more, both for this documentary and the previous work you did remotely, about the steps you take to ensure that the documentary is like best reflecting that environment on the ground, especially if that's not something you can personally experience. And then as a producer as well, just how does that impact the editing process, the decision-making process, as well as the reporting on it?
Okay, so I think there's like 2 questions. So,
Yes.
so the first one, about the experience, so how to so what I didn't mention about filming remotely in a place, recording interviews remotely in a place like Iran, is that you're also dealing with really bad internet and outages, which can be really disruptive to the flow of the story, a bit stressful. And so it's never that like comfortable interview environment where you can take 3 hours, take a break, grab a coffee. It's like you're trying to be efficient, because the internet might cut out and then it'll just disrupt everything. In terms of like reflecting people's experiences despite me not experiencing that, I think it's becoming more and more important to really be mindful of who's telling stories. And I think, again, I just want to, this film was generated by Majid, and he is Iranian. He is now in exile because he can't go home. Although when he left, he didn't necessarily leave knowing that he would never go back. But because of the nature of his work, he can't go home. And he is the interface between us non-Iranians and Iranians. So it was really important that despite it being a very big team, a lot of execs, a lot of opinions, that his take was basically the final kind of point of view. And that is that's really important, is representation. And it is becoming, I think our industry is changing a lot in that way. And I think in filmmaking, people are becoming really, really mindful about who's telling whose stories. And like I've been, the white journalist, filmmaker in East Africa, West Africa, telling other people's stories. But I think, now at the BBC, for example, there's BBC Africa Eye. The whole point of the department is to cultivate talent inside African countries and let people tell their own stories about what's happening in their own countries. And that's all changing, and that's really important. I don't know if that answers your question.
Just as a quick follow-up, I think I liked what you said, that Mahsa always had sort of that his point of view was sort of the final say, but was there ever a point where there was maybe a disagreement, and not necessarily what that was, but how you navigated it, especially as a producer, to make sure that you were sort of reflecting the voices of people who understood?
Yeah, so when I say like the final say, it's more about whenever we're inferring anything about how Iranians feel, like, and I did loads of press when the film came out, and there were journalists who were asking me how Iranians were feeling about something. And it's like, well, I'm not Iranian, so I can't really, I speak to people, but like, I can't tell you what they think about Trump saying this, so it was more the emotional, psychological line of the editorial. When it came to like journalistic points and stuff, that was very much the team effort. But it was more to do with like the kind of the message that was coming across. We needed Majid needed to approve that message, as the Iranian filmmaker. And it's really important also, like, to get the feedback of the three contributors, making sure like there's a constant communication with them, also for us to verify and fact check certain things and make sure that what they said isn't misrepresented, etc., etc.
I have a question for you from Patricia from Poland. How do you assess the future for Iran? Is there going to be a volcanic eruption? What needs to happen to unlock change? I know you're not an Iranian political commentator, but a personal opinion?
I want to say, for the sake of everybody who's taken part in this movement, is that the volcanic eruption started last year, and I don't think it's died. I think it's there. It's still there. It's just a bit different at the moment, and it's died down. But I don't want to say again, like the regime is it's a very difficult environment to navigate, and it won't be easy to topple that regime. I mean, if you look at also like how strong-armed they are, but how strong-armed Bashar al-Assad is, and and everything that happened there. So I think what I've understood is that I think Iranians do not have an appetite for warfare. But I think these constant acts of defiance that continue, that means that there's still a spark. And just to say that the unusual nature of the protests that happened in the past year was that these protests mobilized people who are more kind of conservative, from conservative communities, to protest as well. So it wasn't necessarily only like, it started with the hijab, but it became so much more. And there's constant protests about the economy of the country, about the state of things, the impact the sanctions have had on people's lives. And so even the more conservative communities that wouldn't necessarily be aligned with what Gen Z are fighting for something, and they realize, this regime won't necessarily be the one to resolve their problems. So it's a constant.
I mean, we've had senior pensioners protesting last week, and it hasn't stopped. The protests continue. Noé from Argentina has asked a question. I'm not sure she's aware of what a complex question she's asked, but I'm going to pose it, and you tell me if you want to tackle it. Did you get a chance to show this film in other Middle Eastern countries? And what was their reaction like? Which I think is kind of like how have Sunni nations responded to what they've seen. But that's yeah.
Honestly, I'm just going to be really honest. Like the film, I don't know what the sales of the film have been and all the territories it's been shown in. So that's important to say. It was geo-blocked for definitely for Iran. And I would be lying if I said I actually don't know if it was geo-blocked for the Middle East. I don't think Arabic came in on it. So I don't know what territories it's reached.
Yeah. There is an interesting thing there, though, that a development in recent weeks is that Iranian influences have been, and Palestinian influences have been very vocally set against each other, with Iranian influences saying, I'm warning you, don't do this, and Palestinian influences saying, you have no idea what you're talking about. And it would be interesting to hear a bit of your view on that, why that's happening, and the different viewpoints that those two might be coming from.
Do you mean like Iranian influencers who are anti-Hamas?
Anti-Hamas saying, like, whatever is going on, you cannot be supporting these guys. You can support your freedom, but don't support these guys.
I mean, I think I don't want to give like a definitive answer, as I'm not like a political analyst. But the Iranian regime is a supporter of Hamas. Syria's president is a supporter of Hamas, and I think that potentially it has to do with a lot of Iranians are aware of the role the country has played in other conflicts in the region, and as part of this like bigger mission to secure this kind of access and their role in the region, which is what generals like Qasem Soleimani were fighting for, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard fight for. So I think it could be tied to kind of psychologically also that. But the issue is so much more complex of like supporting Hamas or not Hamas. Like it's Palestinians aren't Hamas, so it's a lot more complex.
Yeah, you handled that answer remarkably well. It's incredibly complex. Omar from Burkina Faso has a question for you.
Hi, Omar.
Thank you very much. Some of my questions have been already answered. I have one or two. The first is, as you were doing some production outside Iran. So the first question is that how did you manage with the credits of the footage that have been sent to you? And how did you take measures to protect those who were sending those footage to you? And the other one is, did you have like a kind of local team that will follow the protests from city to city? And also the other question is how was the immediate outcomes of your film in Iran?
Sorry, can you repeat the third one? How was the immediate
outcomes of your
outcome?
Yeah.
Okay, so with the first one, all I can say is that a lot of the footage was uploaded through portals managed by activists that are unnamed activists who were facilitating the spread of the footage inside and outside of Iran. So a lot of the footage that Majid collected came through these portals and not directly from individuals. So it's not like he was in touch with specific individuals taking part in the protest who were sending him footage. It was all through these platforms. And so in terms of archive, those platforms were credited, but then the people working in those platforms are unnamed individuals. Only like, I mean, some, you know, Imagine knows some of them, but then like it's not known. It's not like they're public. And
I think that's all you can answer there.
that's all I can say.
Yeah.
I can't really answer the second one.
Yeah.
And then the third one is the film wasn't broadcast in Iran. It's probably circulated, and we know Majid's heard from people, and it was received very positively, but it wasn't publicly, you know. But I'm pretty sure the Iranian regime have probably seen it. Someone from the regime has probably seen it, and we've all been blacklisted. That's it.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Imad, I can see your name, but not your question. So if you would like to add your question, I will ask it for you. But meanwhile, Hong Chao has a question that was on my list and is very, very, very close to my heart. Take it away, Hong Chao.
Hi, Sasha. So as a reporter and a storyteller, I wonder if you also have this puzzle, how to keep the right distance with the stories that you're reporting on, and how do you take care of your own mental health while dealing with traumatizing stories like this?
Yeah, 100 hours of incredibly violent footage. How do you take care of yourself?
And 10 years of horrific stories. You know, I mean, so Passion Pictures and Frontline and the BBC were constantly communicating with the team and offering services of assistance, so psychological support during production and post-production, which is something that is new of the past few years in terms of like incorporating mental health for the team and for the contributors, but for the team as part of the production, a budget line in the production. That's become a thing. How I've done it over the years, because this isn't the first film where I've, you know, had to watch or witness horrific violent events, is I'm you know, I have a close network of friends. I'm very talkative. I don't bottle stuff in. It's been actually weirdly, I have a son who's 2, and since I've had him, I've become a lot more sensitive to footage and to things that I've been seeing. So I have to say, like, when I was watching all the Iran footage, I was very, very emotional. I really struggle with the footage that's coming out of Gaza, especially when it's children, which is something that in the past I used to be able to endure, and now I'm really struggling. Maybe it's also because I'm 9 months pregnant as well. But yeah, you know, I have colleagues who are in therapy, and there are psychologists who are specialized in working with journalists, because I think what journalists experience in terms of trauma is different to others, in the sense of, you know, for a long time I never accepted therapy because I felt guilty about the fact that the story wasn't my story. So I don't have a right to feel the way I feel because I didn't experience it. But secondary trauma is very much a thing. And so there are those options. Yeah.
Do you take a recuperation gap between projects?
This time, no, because I finished the Iran project and I've been working on this current project immediately. It was already commissioned, so I was just waiting to finish that. I don't consciously take recuperation gaps. It's more the being freelance in the industry. the hustle of finding the next job that forces you
Forced recuperation.
exactly. So like you're unemployed for a few months while you look for the next thing. So, but again, I have friends and colleagues who had to, that they reach a point where they realize they have to take a break because it's too much.
Sasha, thank you so much for your time today. In the middle of everything that you have going on, we're wishing you the very best of luck for your upcoming release. I hope it all goes smoothly. Thank you for the work that you do and for sharing so generously from your own experience in this. It's been a treat, a real treat.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We're back next week. Oh, go for it, please. Yeah. We are back for one more seminar this term next week on the RSF's new AI charter on AI in journalism, which will be fascinating to hear from. I think the film industry has probably done a better job of organizing themselves on AI than we have, but that will be a good discussion. Until next time, Sasha, our door is always open to you. Come on down anytime.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, go well.